Imagine an island so small that its entire population could fit inside a single subway car, with room to spare. A place so remote that the nearest neighbor is not a city, not a town, not even a village, but an ocean. Thousands of kilometers of open, churning Pacific water stretching in every direction without interruption. A place where there is no airport you can simply book a ticket to, no ferry schedule you can plan around, no road that eventually connects you back to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is simply not there. Where 47 people, give or take the occasional arrival or departure, share a single rugged hillside of volcanic rock rising out of the southern Pacific, carrying between them the entire weight of a community, a culture, a history, and a way of life that most people alive today have never witnessed and will almost certainly never see with their own eyes. This is Pitcairn Island, and before we go any further into its extraordinary story, if genuinely remote, genuinely strange, genuinely human corners of our planet like this one fascinate you the way they fascinate us, hit subscribe right now, because today we are walking through exactly how life actually works for the smallest permanently inhabited community under any national flag anywhere on Earth. A place so isolated and so singular that simply describing it feels like inventing something. Turn on notifications as well, because we have many more journeys like this one still coming, and you will not want to miss where we go next. Pitcairn Island sits in the southern Pacific Ocean, at a latitude roughly equivalent to southern Brazil, yet surrounded by absolutely nothing resembling either, just open water, wind, and the particular quality of silence that only truly isolated oceanic islands possess. Its nearest inhabited neighbor is the Gambier Islands, a part of French Polynesia, sitting roughly 490 kilometers to the northwest. Which sounds close enough until you realize there is no regular boat connection between the two, no casual commute, no relationship you could describe as neighborly in any conventional sense. The nearest major city is Auckland, New Zealand, roughly 5,000 kilometers to the southwest. The Chilean mainland, over which Pitcairn's British colonial administration once had certain logistical arrangements, sits well over 6,000 kilometers away. There is no airport on the island, none has ever been built, and none could practically be built given the island's topography, a rugged volcanic mass of steep cliffs and dense subtropical vegetation that leaves almost no flat ground anywhere. Getting to Pitcairn, if you are determined enough to try, means arranging passage aboard one of the occasional container ships or supply vessels that passes through the region on roughly quarterly schedules, then transferring to a small aluminum longboat lowered from the ship, riding waves into a notoriously unpredictable landing called Bounty Bay, and hauling yourself ashore up a steep concrete ramp while the Pacific does whatever it feels like doing that particular day. There is no guarantee of when you will be able to leave. This is the context within which 47 people wake up every morning, make coffee, go to work, raise children, navigate disagreements, celebrate births, mourn deaths, and try to build lives that feel meaningful and sustainable on an island measuring roughly 3.6 square kilometers. A piece of land smaller than many urban parks in major cities, home to a community so small that every single person knows every single other person by name, by family history, by personality, by the particular way they drive their quad bike up the steep dirt track that passes for the island's main road. To understand Pitcairn today, you must first understand how it came to be inhabited at all, because the story of how human beings ended up on this particular volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific is one of the most genuinely dramatic, morally complex, and historically remarkable stories in the entire history of human settlement anywhere on this planet. It begins in 1789 with a British naval vessel called HMS Bounty, commanded by Lieutenant William Bligh, on a mission to transport breadfruit plants from Tahiti to the West Indies as a cheap food source for enslaved people working plantation labor there. The Bounty had spent 5 months anchored in Tahiti, long enough for many crew members to form deep attachments to the island and to Tahitian women, relationships that made the prospect of returning to harsh naval discipline and a long voyage seem genuinely intolerable by comparison. On April 28, 1789, crew members led by Master's Mate Fletcher Christian seized the ship in what became history's most famous naval mutiny, cast Bligh and 18 loyal crew members adrift in a small, open boat with minimal supplies, and took control of the Bounty. Bligh, in one of maritime history's most extraordinary survival stories, navigated his open boat nearly 4,800 kilometers to Timor, losing only one crew member to violence along the way, and eventually returned to England where he reported the mutiny. The Admiralty dispatched HMS Pandora to hunt down the mutineers, and a Royal Navy court-martial eventually condemned 3 men to death, though Fletcher Christian himself was never found. What happened to Christian and his core group of fellow mutineers became one of the 19th century's great maritime mysteries, eventually solved when an American seal hunting vessel called the Topaz stumbled across Pitcairn Island in 1808 and found it inhabited. An elderly Tahitian woman named Oeno, known to the settlers as Jenny, and a single surviving mutineer, John Adams, surrounded by a community of mixed heritage children and young adults who had been born and raised on the island in complete isolation from the rest of the world. The full story of what had happened on Pitcairn between 1790 and 1808 emerged gradually through accounts from various survivors and participants over the following years, and it was not a comfortable story. The original settlement party had consisted of 9 British mutineers, 6 Polynesian men brought from Tahiti, and 12 Tahitian women, some of whom had come willingly, and some under circumstances that were considerably more complicated. The first years on the island descended into violence, driven by conflict over land allocation, over the treatment of the Tahitian men who had been reduced to something approaching servitude by the British mutineers, and over access to women. By 1800, all 6 Tahitian men were dead, as were 5 of the original 9 British mutineers, killed in a spiral of retaliatory violence that left only 4 survivors: John Adams, Matthew Quintal, Edward Young, and William McCoy. Quintal was subsequently killed by Adams and Young. McCoy died after making himself a crude alcohol still and apparently falling from a cliff while intoxicated, and Young died of illness, leaving John Adams as the sole surviving mutineer, responsible by default for raising a community of children and widows in isolation on a tiny volcanic island with no outside contact whatsoever. Adams, according to accounts gathered from those who later met him, underwent a significant personal transformation during this period, becoming deeply religious and taking it upon himself to educate the island's children in reading, scripture, and what he understood of proper conduct, creating a small, tight community built around an unusual blend of Pacific and British cultural elements, centered on religious observation and mutual dependence. When the Topaz arrived in 1808 and the world learned of Pitcairn's existence and its remarkable inhabitants, Adams was neither captured nor prosecuted for his role in the mutiny, a decision apparently driven by practical and humanitarian considerations, and he continued leading the community until his death in 1829, becoming something close to a founding patriarch in island memory. The Pitcairn community's subsequent history across the 19th and 20th centuries traces an extraordinary arc of transplantation, return, and stubborn persistence. The entire population was evacuated twice, first to Tahiti in 1831, which ended quickly when illness killed many islanders and the survivors asked to return home, and then to Norfolk Island in 1856, when the British colonial administration decided the island's growing population had exceeded what its limited resources could sustain. Most Pitcairners chose to remain on Norfolk Island permanently, and their descendants still form a distinct community there today. But 2 families chose to return to Pitcairn in 1858 and 1864, and from those few returning individuals, the present community descends. The surnames that dominate Pitcairn today, Christian, Warren, Brown, Young, all trace directly back to the mutineers and their Tahitian companions who settled the island over 2 centuries ago, surnames that function as living historical documents, connecting every current islander directly to the remarkable, complicated events of 1790. Today's community of approximately 47 people occupies the island's only settlement, a cluster of homes, community buildings, and gardens perched on a relatively flat area known as Adamstown, reached from Bounty Bay by a steep path called the Hill of Difficulty, which is exactly as demanding as its name suggests, and which every islander climbs and descends as a routine part of daily life. Adamstown contains the island's church, its small museum, its post office, its medical center, its single small store, and the modest homes where all 47 residents live, connected by dirt tracks navigated primarily by quad bikes, the universal vehicle of choice, given the impracticality of larger vehicles on such steep, narrow terrain. The population of Pitcairn has been declining for decades, driven by a combination of factors that affect isolated island communities everywhere, but which hit Pitcairn with particular force, given its already tiny population. Young people who seek higher education must leave the island entirely, and many do not return. The practical difficulties of daily life, the isolation, the limited economic opportunity, the complete dependence on outside supply ships, weigh more heavily on some residents than others, and the pull of easier circumstances elsewhere can be powerful and permanent. The 2004 criminal trials that saw a significant portion of the island's male population convicted of serious historical offenses against young women and girls represented a catastrophic moment in the community's modern history, one whose effects on the island's population, reputation, and internal social dynamics continue to reverberate today in ways that islanders discuss with varying degrees of openness depending on context and relationship. The population, which had once stood at over 200 in the late 19th century, has contracted to its current extraordinary low, raising genuinely serious questions about whether Pitcairn as a permanently inhabited settlement can survive another generation. Questions the British government, which administers Pitcairn as its sole remaining Pacific territory, and the islanders themselves, have been wrestling with in various ways for years. Daily life in Adamstown operates around rhythms shaped by the island's fundamental conditions, its isolation, its geography, its small population, and its history. There is no currency-based local economy in any recognizable conventional sense. No shops where you earn wages and buy groceries in a cycle remotely similar to what characterizes economic life in connected, commercial societies. Instead, Pitcairn functions largely on a basis of community labor, resource sharing, and subsistence production supplemented by periodic supply deliveries and the modest income streams available through a handful of specific activities. Gardens are the foundation of daily subsistence, growing sweet potatoes, taro, yams, bananas, coconuts, breadfruit, avocados, citrus fruits, squash, and a wide range of vegetables in volcanic soil that, despite the island's challenging terrain, is genuinely fertile and productive throughout much of the year. Almost every household maintains a significant garden, and gardening is not a hobby or a weekend activity, but a fundamental part of how food ends up on the table each day. Pitcairners have always grown much of their own food, and that tradition of self-sufficiency, born of necessity across 2 centuries of isolation, remains absolutely central to daily life, in a way that has perhaps become rare in much of the rest of the world. Fishing supplements the garden diet significantly, with the waters surrounding Pitcairn holding a genuine abundance of tropical Pacific fish species, including various reef fish, tuna, mahi-mahi, and other pelagic species that can be taken from the island's small longboats. Traditional fishing knowledge accumulated across generations of Pitcairn life continues to be practiced and shared, and a successful fishing expedition provides not just protein for the fishing family's table, but often excess to share with neighbors and community members, maintaining a gift economy of food distribution that functions as one of the social glues holding such a small community together across the natural frictions and conflicts that inevitably arise in any group of human beings living in such close, unavoidable proximity to one another. The supply ship represents perhaps the single most important event in Pitcairn's community calendar, arriving roughly 4 times per year aboard vessels contracted to supply the island, and occasionally via other passing ships that agree to call in with goods or passengers. When a supply ship is spotted approaching, the entire community mobilizes, because getting goods ashore from a ship anchored in Bounty Bay is a challenging collective effort requiring coordination, skill, and every able-bodied person available to help. The famous Pitcairn longboat, maintained and operated by islanders who have been navigating these particular waters all their lives, goes out to meet the ship, regardless of sea conditions that would stop less experienced boatmen entirely, since an arriving supply ship waits only so long before its schedule requires it to move on, and missing the opportunity could mean waiting months for the next one. Cargo is transferred from ship to longboat in open water, brought ashore through the surf at Bounty Bay, hauled up the concrete ramp, and then transported up to Adamstown by quad bike, a process that requires hours of sustained community effort, and which, when complete, leaves islanders with whatever supplies they will need to supplement their own production for the next several months. Fuel for generators, cooking gas, flour, sugar, rice, canned goods, medical supplies, spare parts for mechanical equipment, mail that has been waiting at Mangareva in French Polynesia sometimes for weeks, all of it arrives in one collective effort that functions as something between a major logistics operation and a community festival. The income that allows Pitcairners to purchase those supplies comes from a handful of specific sources, the most significant of which has historically been the sale of postage stamps. Pitcairn stamps are genuine philatelic collector's items, sought by stamp collectors worldwide, not just because of the inherent interest of Pitcairn itself, but because stamps from such a remote and extraordinary place carry a genuine rarity value and cultural cachet difficult to replicate. The island's postal service produces regular stamp issues depicting the island's landscapes, wildlife, history, and cultural heritage, selling them to collectors worldwide through mail-order catalogs, and in more recent years, through online platforms that have made it substantially easier to reach the global market of collectors willing to pay premium prices for Pitcairn postal products. The honey produced from Pitcairn's beehives has also become an important revenue source, with the island's geographic isolation from agricultural chemicals and imported bee diseases giving Pitcairn honey a genuine, verifiable purity that commands significant premium pricing in the New Zealand and other markets where it is sold. Various other crafts and artisanal goods produced on the island, including carved wooden items, woven baskets, and other traditional craft pieces, find buyers through the island's website and through sales made directly to the occasional visitor who manages to arrange passage out to the island. Tourism exists on Pitcairn, but in a form almost unrecognizable compared to conventional tourism elsewhere, because the absence of an airport, the difficulty and expense of reaching the island by sea, and the very limited accommodation available mean that the number of visitors reaching Pitcairn in any given year is typically counted in the hundreds rather than the thousands or hundreds of thousands that characterize tourism to even modestly popular destinations. The island has invested in developing a small set of visitor accommodations, homes where visiting guests can stay as paying guests with local families, and various guided walks and cultural experiences that give visitors insight into the island's remarkable history, its ecology, and daily life in this most unusual of communities. These visitors, when they arrive, represent a genuinely meaningful economic contribution to the island, given the small scale of everything on Pitcairn, and many islanders take genuine pleasure in sharing their extraordinary home with people curious enough and determined enough to have made the significant effort required to get there. The cruise ships that occasionally include Pitcairn on their itineraries without actually landing passengers, instead anchoring offshore, while islanders come out by longboat to sell crafts and stamps, represent another modest but meaningful income stream, one that requires no overnight accommodation infrastructure, but does require the community to quickly mobilize for commerce whenever a ship appears on the horizon. The internet arrived on Pitcairn via satellite connection, and its significance to community life and economic activity can hardly be overstated, given how dramatically it changed the practical relationship between such a remote island and the rest of the world. Before reliable internet connectivity, communication with the outside world depended on radio, on the arrival of supply ships, and on the slower rhythms of mail that could take weeks or months to travel each way. Today, islanders can video call family members who have moved to New Zealand or elsewhere, can conduct business through online platforms for stamp and honey sales, can access news and entertainment, can maintain social connections with the wider world in something approaching real time. For a community that once endured a quality of isolation almost medieval in its comprehensiveness, reliable internet represents a genuine transformation in the experience of daily life, softening without eliminating the fundamental remoteness that continues to define Pitcairn's reality in every other practical dimension. Governance on Pitcairn operates through a small internal council elected by the island's eligible adult voters, working within the framework of British Overseas Territory status, with a governor based in Auckland who has formal administrative oversight, and a British representative also based off-island who manages ongoing liaison between the community and the British government. The island's internal island council handles day-to-day decisions about community matters, including the management of communal resources, decisions about visitor management and accommodation, maintenance of public infrastructure, and the countless smaller questions of community administration that arise in any settlement, regardless of its size. Given that the total adult population eligible to vote and potentially serve in any community roll numbers somewhere around 30 people on a good day, the relationship between governing and being governed on Pitcairn is necessarily intimate and immediate in a way that differs profoundly from governance anywhere else. The island mayor, who chairs the council, and serves as a primary community representative, is elected from and by this tiny population, and whoever holds that role is simultaneously a neighbor, a friend, a relative, and often a fellow participant in the same daily community labor of gardens and fishing and supply ship unloading that every other islander undertakes. English is the official language of governance, education, and administration on Pitcairn, given its British Overseas Territory status. But the most remarkable linguistic feature of the island is the survival and daily use of a Creole language known as Pitcairn, sometimes spelled Pitcairn or rendered as Pitcairn North, a language that developed naturally during the first generation of island settlement from the mixing of 18th-century English nautical speech with Tahitian vocabulary and grammatical structures. Pitcairn is a genuinely distinctive linguistic creation, emerging spontaneously from the particular circumstances of the island's founding, spoken between islanders in everyday informal conversation, in community gatherings, and in the kind of casual social interaction that fills daily life. Its vocabulary includes words drawn from archaic English maritime speech that have long since disappeared from mainstream English usage, alongside Tahitian-derived terms and grammatical patterns that reflect the Polynesian linguistic influence embedded in the island's origins. For the islanders who speak it, Pitcairn is not an academic curiosity, but a living, practical part of daily communication, and a meaningful marker of shared Pitcairn identity that distinguishes them from both their British administrative connection and from the broader Polynesian Pacific cultural context in which the island sits geographically. Efforts to document and preserve Pitcairn have been ongoing, including the production of a Pitcairn dictionary, motivated by the recognition that a language with fewer than 50 speakers faces genuine existential risk if active effort is not made to maintain and pass it on. Healthcare on Pitcairn operates through a small medical center staffed by a nurse, who is typically recruited from New Zealand or elsewhere on a rotating contract basis rather than being a permanent island resident, equipped to handle routine medical care, basic emergency treatment, and the day-to-day health needs of a tiny community. For anything beyond routine care, the situation becomes considerably more complicated, as it does with almost everything requiring specialist capability or significant resources on an island this remote. Serious illness or injury requiring hospitalization, surgery, or specialist medical attention means evacuation by sea to the nearest island with an airstrip capable of connecting to New Zealand or other medical facilities, a process that can take many hours simply to arrange transport, and that depends on sea conditions permitting safe longboat operation. Medical evacuations from Pitcairn represent some of the most dramatic and genuinely anxious moments in community life, requiring coordination with passing ships, with maritime authorities, and with medical facilities at the other end of a very long and logistically complicated journey. The island's nurse manages dental care as well as general medical needs, drawing on supplies brought in by supply ships, and telemedicine technology has become increasingly valuable in allowing the island's medical staff to consult remotely with specialist physicians for cases beyond immediate on-island diagnostic capability. Education on Pitcairn has historically been provided through a small school in Adamstown, serving whatever children happen to be at their island at any given time, staffed by a teacher recruited from New Zealand or elsewhere on a contract basis, since the island's own population is too small to reliably provide qualified teaching staff from within the community itself. The school serves primary and lower secondary level students, providing the foundational education that island children need, embedded as much as possible in the particular context and history of Pitcairn itself, including knowledge of the island's natural environment, its historical story, traditional practices, and the Pitcairn language alongside standard English curriculum requirements. For secondary and particularly for post-secondary education, young Pitcairners must leave the island, typically traveling to New Zealand where the British government supports educational opportunities, entering a completely different world from the one in which they grew up, and facing the same choice that young people from remote communities everywhere eventually confront about whether and when to return. The relatively low number of school-age children on the island at any given time reflects both the community's small total population and the departure of many young adults and their families in search of educational and economic opportunities that Pitcairn cannot provide, making the maintenance of the school a community priority that goes well beyond simple educational function, representing a statement of confidence in the island's future as a place where families with children intend to remain. Energy on Pitcairn is supplied primarily through diesel generators, with fuel arriving by supply ship, representing one of the community's most significant and least negotiable ongoing expenses and logistical requirements. Without regular fuel supply, the generators stop, and without generators, electricity stops, with cascading effects on refrigeration, water pumping, communications, medical equipment, and the full range of other infrastructure systems that modern life requires, even in as basic a form as it exists on Pitcairn. The vulnerability created by this dependence on periodic fuel deliveries has motivated exploration of renewable energy alternatives, with solar power representing the most practically feasible option, given the island's considerable sunshine and the potential for solar generation to substantially reduce or eventually eliminate fuel dependence for electricity, a development that would represent both a significant cost saving and a major reduction in one of the community's most significant logistical vulnerabilities. Wind energy has also been explored, though the practical challenges of installing and maintaining wind turbine infrastructure on such a remote island present their own set of complications. The transition toward renewable energy represents one of the most practically significant ongoing community development projects on the island, with implications that extend well beyond the technical details of electricity generation into the broader question of how Pitcairn sustains its physical infrastructure and its community life across the decades ahead. Water supply on the island relies on rainfall collection and natural springs, with a gravity-fed system distributing water to homes throughout Adamstown from storage tanks filled by rain. The island's subtropical location and its topography, which catches rainfall reliably through much of the year, mean that water supply is generally adequate under normal conditions, though extended dry periods can create genuine pressure on storage, adding another dimension to the community's ongoing management of its limited and essentially irreplaceable natural resources. The lush vegetation covering much of the island's interior, including dense tropical forest in the valleys and on the steeper slopes, reflects the general adequacy of rainfall even if its distribution through the year is not perfectly uniform. Wildlife on Pitcairn represents one of the island's most remarkable and most underappreciated natural assets, with the island and its surrounding ocean hosting a range of species found in few or no other places on Earth. The waters around Pitcairn, Henderson, Ducie, and Oeno, the other islands of the Pitcairn group that fall under the same British Overseas Territory status despite being uninhabited, are among the most pristine marine environments remaining anywhere in the Pacific, supporting extraordinary coral reef ecosystems, diverse fish populations, and marine mammal populations of a quality and abundance rarely found in areas with any significant human presence. Pitcairn Island and its neighboring islands within the group are home to seabird species that nest nowhere else on Earth, including the Henderson petrel and the Pitcairn reed warbler, species whose continued survival depends directly on the remarkably pristine condition of the island environment. The British government declared the waters around the Pitcairn Islands one of the world's largest marine protected areas in 2015, an area covering roughly 800,000 square kilometers of ocean, prohibiting commercial fishing and other extractive activities within this enormous reserve, and making the Pitcairn Islands a centerpiece of one of the most significant ocean conservation commitments made by any government anywhere in recent decades. For the islanders, this marine protection carries both genuine environmental pride and some practical implications for their own fishing activities, which continue within the reserve under terms that recognize the community's traditional subsistence rights, while prohibiting the commercial-scale fishing that the broader reserve designation is designed to prevent. Henderson Island, roughly 170 kilometers northeast of Pitcairn, and the largest island in the group by area, is one of the world's outstanding examples of an uplifted coral atoll ecosystem, essentially untouched by permanent human settlement and supporting extraordinary biodiversity, including those species found nowhere else. It is listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a designation recognizing its exceptional natural value and the remarkable rarity of finding an ecosystem of such scale and completeness, essentially undisturbed in the modern world. Pitcairners traditionally visited Henderson for specific resources, particularly the miro wood used in carving and the pandanus leaves used in weaving, and these periodic visits to Henderson have continued into recent times, representing both a practical resource collection activity and a cultural connection to traditional practices associated with the island, across many generations of Pitcairn history. Oeno Island, a coral atoll roughly 120 kilometers northwest of Pitcairn, serves a rather different but deeply cherished function in contemporary Pitcairn community life. as the destination for regular community camping trips that represent some of the most anticipated and collectively enjoyed events in the island's social calendar. The Oeno trip, undertaken by the Pitcairn community, collectively on a longboat voyage across open ocean, delivers islanders onto the atoll's beautiful lagoon beach for several days of camping, fishing, relaxation, and collective enjoyment of a setting that, while also extraordinarily remote, offers the particular pleasure of somewhere different, somewhere that is not Adamstown's familiar paths and gardens and buildings, but open white sand and turquoise lagoon water, and the distinct quality of freedom that comes from being somewhere beautiful and entirely unscheduled. For a community that has essentially no opportunity for casual weekend travel to anywhere else, the Oeno trip functions as a genuine vacation in the deepest sense. A periodic collective reset that sustains morale and communal bonds across the long stretches of ordinary island life between visits. Community social life in Adamstown revolves around a modest collection of shared spaces and regular collective activities that take on heightened significance given how small the community is and how limited the options for socializing outside it are. The island's public hall functions as the center of community gatherings, hosting meetings, celebrations, shared meals, and the kind of collective social activity that keeps 47 people who see each other constantly from becoming 47 individuals, merely coexisting in the same small space. Adventist religious observance plays a significant role in weekly life for many islanders, the community having converted to Seventh-day Adventism in 1886 following visits by a Seventh-day Adventist missionary, with Saturday observed as the Sabbath, and church attendance representing a meaningful weekly community gathering point that structures the rhythms of the week. The Adventist influence has shaped various practical aspects of island life as well, including dietary traditions that in some households reflect the Adventist emphasis on vegetarianism and avoidance of certain foods, though practice varies between families and individuals in the way it does in any real community where formal religious affiliation exists, alongside the full diversity of human choices about how to actually live. Birthdays, arrivals, departures, and supply ship days all function as genuine community events on Pitcairn in a way that would be difficult to replicate anywhere with a significantly larger population, because in a group of 47 people, every individual event affecting any one member of the community is, in practical terms, an event affecting the entire community. When someone leaves the island, the community becomes measurably smaller. When someone arrives to join it, the community becomes measurably larger. When a baby is born, the birth matters enormously, not just to the family, but to the community's collective sense of its own viability and future. When someone dies, the community's working capacity and social network is tangibly diminished, the absence felt in practical as well as emotional terms, in a way that the scale of larger societies simply does not allow, where individual departures and arrivals are absorbed into an anonymous statistical flow, rather than registered as significant events, shaping the lived experience of everyone present. The question of Pitcairn's future as a permanently inhabited settlement is not an abstract academic question, but something islanders and the British government have been wrestling with in concrete, practical terms for years, driven by the reality that a population this small faces a genuinely precarious demographic situation, where the departure of a relatively small number of families could shift the community below the practical threshold required to sustain basic collective infrastructure and social cohesion. The British government has at various points explored programs to attract new residents to Pitcairn, offering land and other incentives to people willing to settle permanently on the island and contribute to its community life. Programs that have attracted considerable media attention and varying degrees of practical success. Some individuals and families attracted by the romance of the island's extraordinary story and by the appeal of a genuinely different kind of life have indeed made the move, bringing fresh energy, new skills, and additional population to the community, though the practical realities of Pitcairn life have also led some who tried it to conclude that the combination of isolation, limited opportunity, and the social dynamics of such an intensely small community were not ultimately compatible with the lives they wanted to build. The social dynamics of living with 47 people in total isolation deserve particular thought, because they operate under rules that simply do not apply in any community with more room for social distance and privacy. On Pitcairn, you cannot avoid the person you had an argument with last week. You cannot find a different social circle when your current relationships feel strained. You cannot retreat into anonymity, or simply not see someone whose company you find difficult, because every path on the island eventually leads past everyone else's home, because every community gathering necessarily includes everyone, because the work of maintaining communal infrastructure requires cooperation, regardless of the state of any particular personal relationship. This creates both the extraordinary closeness of a genuine community, the kind of mutual knowledge, practical interdependence, and shared history that most human beings alive today will never experience, and the particular pressures and frictions that inevitably arise when human beings, with all their ordinary complexity and imperfection, are required to remain in unavoidable close relationship with the same small set of other people across the whole span of their lives. Pitcairners who have spoken with researchers and journalists about daily life often emphasize both the genuine beauty and the genuine difficulty of this intimacy, the warmth of knowing yourself, truly known by the people around you, balanced against the weight of having no private experience, no anonymous space, no corner of life not visible to community awareness. They describe the island itself with a love that is clearly genuine and deep, the green hills and the clear water, and the extraordinary night sky uncontaminated by any light pollution whatsoever, a darkness so complete and a star display so vivid that residents treat it almost as a casual background feature of ordinary life, even as visitors who manage to reach the island often cite it as one of the most profound sensory experiences they have ever had. They describe the feeling of self-sufficiency, of knowing exactly where their food comes from, of being able to fix their own equipment and navigate their own waters, and provide directly for their own households, as a source of quiet pride and genuine satisfaction that exists alongside and not in contradiction with the very real hardships of their circumstances. The island's connection to the bounty story remains present in daily life, not as a performed tourist attraction, though it does attract the historically curious among the limited number of visitors who reach the island, but as genuine lived history, threaded through everything from family surnames to place names to community traditions. The anchor from HMS Bounty itself sits in the Pitcairn Museum, recovered from Bounty Bay where the mutineers burned and sank the ship shortly after arriving, to prevent anyone having second thoughts about escape or discovery. The site where the ship was burned is visible from shore. The graves of early settlers, some of the original mutineers, and their Tahitian companions, are maintained and visited, not as tourist attractions primarily, but as family graves, the resting places of direct ancestors buried within living memory of the oldest island traditions. Fletcher Christian remains a presence in community consciousness in a way that speaks to how intimately this population lives with its own history, his descendants still on the island carrying his surname and his story as part of their daily inheritance. The natural environment of the island itself, the cliffs and the valleys and the forest and the ocean, carries a quality that islanders describe with a vocabulary of belonging that suggests a relationship to landscape as deep and specific as any indigenous relationship to place anywhere on Earth, which in many respects is precisely what it is, the accumulated relationship of a community that has been born, lived, and buried on this specific piece of volcanic rock across 10 generations of continuous habitation. The birds that nest on the island's cliffs, the fish that move through its waters with the seasons, the plants that grow wild in its valleys and cultivated in its gardens, the particular sounds and smells and qualities of light at different times of day across the year, all of this constitutes the known world for people who have never experienced any other landscape as home, even if many of them have traveled and will travel beyond the island across their lifetimes. The return to Pitcairn, for those who leave and choose to come back, is described in terms that suggest something more fundamental than mere preference, something closer to a recognition that this particular place, with all its difficulty and all its beauty, is where they belong in a sense that nowhere else can quite replicate. The physical work of island life deserves particular attention, because on Pitcairn, the ordinary maintenance of daily existence requires a level and range of practical physical skill and effort that modern connected societies have increasingly outsourced to specialists, institutions, and industrial systems. Gardens must be dug, planted, tended, and harvested by hand. Fishing boats must be maintained, launched, operated, and hauled. Generators must be serviced and repaired. Water systems must be checked and maintained. Buildings must be repaired and adapted using whatever materials are available. Improvising solutions to problems when the specific part or material required is not on the island and the next supply ship is months away. Roads, such as they are, require maintenance, The computer systems and communications infrastructure must be kept functioning. Community vehicles must be kept running. All of this work falls on the labor pool available, which is to say roughly 47 people of varying ages and abilities, meaning that everyone who is physically capable of contributing does so, across a range of tasks significantly wider than most people in more connected societies are ever required to master. The quad bikes that serve as the universal transportation solution on Pitcairn represent something of a microcosm of this practical self-sufficiency ethos, because when a quad bike breaks down on Pitcairn, you cannot simply take it to a dealership or call a mobile mechanic. You fix it yourself, or you ask a neighbor who knows more about the particular problem than you do, working from whatever replacement parts happen to arrive on the last supply ship or whatever you can fabricate from what you have available. This approach of improvising solutions, of maintaining and extending the useful life of everything rather than simply replacing it, of building and sharing practical knowledge across the community rather than depending on external specialist services, characterizes the practical culture of the island in ways that echo similar cultures found in other extremely remote communities, but which take on a particular intensity on Pitcairn, given that the support of any external service or specialist requires arrangements spanning thousands of kilometers of open ocean. Music and cultural expression on Pitcairn continue in community gatherings, in church services where traditional hymns and more recent island music both find their place, and in the informal social life of a community that has always found ways to entertain itself with the resources at hand across 2 centuries of isolation. The particular musical traditions of the island blend Christian hymn-singing traditions brought by the Adventist conversion with older community musical expressions, creating a distinctive cultural sound rooted entirely in the island's own historical experience, rather than imported wholesale from any particular external tradition. Traditional crafts, particularly the carving that produces the wooden items sold to collectors and the occasional visitor, represent both economic activity and cultural continuation. Skills passed down through families and representing a material connection to the island's particular aesthetic sensibility developed across generations. The relationship between Pitcairn and New Zealand carries particular practical significance in contemporary island life, given that New Zealand serves as the primary external hub for islanders traveling off-island, for the recruitment of teachers, nurses, and other contracted professionals needed on the island, for the routing of mail and supplies, and for the overseas lives of many Pitcairners who have relocated there while maintaining connections to the island community. A significant Pitcairn diaspora exists in New Zealand. People born on the island who have moved to pursue education, employment, and family life in a more connected setting, but who retain deep emotional and often active practical connections to the island, sending back skills and support in various forms, and sometimes returning permanently after a period away. This diaspora represents a complex social reality for the on-island community, simultaneously a source of external support and connection, and a reminder of the departure of people the island might wish it could retain. The question of what sustainable island life looks like across the next generation is the most important conversation happening on Pitcairn and about Pitcairn simultaneously in both the island community itself and in the British government offices responsible for its administration. Various development schemes, funding programs, and infrastructure investments have been directed at the island over the years with the goal of making Pitcairn life more practically sustainable and the community more viable at its current or ideally larger population scale. Tourism development, as limited as it necessarily is given the access constraints, continues to receive attention as a potential avenue for modest economic growth without requiring dramatic changes to the island's infrastructure or character. The marine protected area and its conservation significance has opened some pathways for research partnerships and conservation funding that bring modest economic benefit alongside the broader environmental importance of the reserve. Renewable energy investments continue to progress. The satellite internet connection that now links the island reliably to global digital networks continues to expand the possibilities for remote work and e-commerce that might allow more islanders to build sustainable economic lives without being forced to leave. And yet, beyond the specific policy interventions and development programs, the question of Pitcairn's future ultimately comes back to something more fundamental than economics or infrastructure, to the choices that individual families and individual young people make about whether they want to build their lives on this island, accepting the extraordinary isolation and practical difficulty in exchange for the equally extraordinary beauty, intimacy, self-determination, and sense of belonging to something genuinely irreplaceable that Pitcairn offers. People who choose Pitcairn, whether they are born there or choose to move there as adults, are making a statement about what they value in a life. A statement that puts community, place, and a particular kind of authentic, physically grounded existence above the convenience, opportunity, and anonymity of connected modern life elsewhere. That statement carries a genuine weight and a genuine dignity, and whatever ultimately happens to